Good evening and welcome to our first Fourscore Speaker Series of 2024. Tonight, we are excited to welcome Dr. James Reed to discuss his recently released book, Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule, and Slavery. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is the only national foundation focused on increasing access to history, educational programs, exhibits, and sites highlighting the life and legacy of Abraham Lincoln. We do this work through our own original projects and in cooperation and partnership with others locally, nationally, and globally. For more information on how you can support this mission, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd just like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box below and we'll get to as many as possible. And now please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, and thank you all for joining us for the Lincoln Presidential Foundation's Fourscore Speaker Series program. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. James Reed to discuss his latest book, Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule, and Slavery. The book explores Abraham Lincoln's understanding of majority rule and his faith and hope that even the most difficult political questions could and should be resolved through peaceful, democratic methods. James H. Reed is a professor of political science at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University in Minnesota. In addition to Sovereign of a Free People, he's the author of Power versus Liberty, Madison, Hamilton, Wilson, and Jefferson, Doorstep Democracy, Face-to-Face Politics in the Heartland, and Majority Rule versus Consensus, the Political Thought of John C. Calhoun. He's also authored numerous articles and book chapters in the fields of political theory and American political thought. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1988, and he lives in Avon, Minnesota. James, it's a pleasure to have you on the program.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Erin Mast and Phyllis Evans of the Lincoln Presidential Foundation for inviting me to do this webinar. Thank you to all of you who are participating tonight, either live or who may be watching this later on recording. I welcome your questions and responses.
Excellent. Well, to get things started, James, our audience often appreciates hearing about what drew our guests to their field. So will you please share with us what inspired you to pursue a career in political science?
Well, in certain ways, I grew up, my parents were very active in helping to create the Indiana Dunes National Park. So when I was a kid, they would take us, we would meet congressmen and senators, Senator Paul Douglas from Illinois among them. And on more than one occasion, we went to Washington, D.C. We saw my father testify. And so to me, this showed that democracy could work. And I think many young people today are very negative on democracy. I grew up with the opposite message, that this was something that could work if men and women of good faith put their trust in it and put their work into it. And so in another way, that's also what inspires me about Abraham Lincoln.
Great. Well, and this isn't your first book on the subject of majority rule or on a president's views of founding ideas or democracy.
Yeah.
And you've written articles on Lincoln in particular in this subject.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to write a full book on Abraham Lincoln and these ideas, and why now?
Yeah. Well, I have read Lincoln since even before I was in college. I've taught Lincoln in courses. So I've always thought about his writing and been inspired by him. But there's so many books out there on Abraham Lincoln, hundreds of thousands of books on Abraham Lincoln. So it's kind of intimidating to think, what could I say that's new? And by a sort of circuitous route, by exploring the thinking of people who are opposed to majority rule. So John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, he's mentioned in the Lincoln book, he and Lincoln were really kind of two opposing poles of political thought in antebellum America. And I think that thinking about majority rule and slavery and democracy from the perspective of a slaveholder who was very distrustful of majority rule, gave me a perspective on Lincoln that maybe other people wouldn't have who hadn't followed that sort of train of thought. And so I finally wrote this book because I realized that I did have something new to say, that in all the hundreds of thousands of books about Abraham Lincoln, to my knowledge, mine is the only one that explores from beginning to end in depth his understanding of majority rule and his defense of majority rule. I will also say that I've been working on this book actively since about 2010. As I was writing the book, during that decade, American democracy itself now became more troubled and unstable and began to feel more and more like the dividedness of the 1850s. And that didn't end well. So my book has a kind of relevance that's usually we're happy about relevance. This is a kind of disturbing relevance for my book, that there is now, I think, among many people on both sides of the political spectrum, a declining faith in democracy and a willingness to resort to violence rather than trust in what Lincoln called peaceful ballots to resolve differences. So that, in a way, is what drew me to that in the first place. And the closer the book came to publication, the more important I believe that message to be.
Yeah, and what an important time to have it too. I saw a statistic that there are going to be more democratically held elections globally this year in 2024 than at any other point in history, that they're all just converging in this one year. And so these concepts are very important and timely to be explored in this way. And I have to say that it was helpful hearing that background and perspective on why you felt this subject and why now, because I found myself throughout reading your book thinking, I knew that, but I've never heard it framed that way or phrased with that added context. And I found it very helpful in sort of fleshing out some of these ideas that maybe I read about before, but with a slightly different perspective, and just even a slight different perspective, as you know, moving a couple feet to one side, you could suddenly see things clearly you couldn't before, right? So
that's one of the things I like about Lincoln is he's such a complex, thoughtful person. He lives through such complex times that it always offers fresh perspective, even on things that you think you knew about. It always he and the period always offers fresh perspective.
Well said. Well, so the title of your book comes from President Lincoln's first inaugural address in a paragraph where Lincoln says, quote, "Plainly, the central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. Whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Unanimity is impossible. The rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left." As we know, this isn't purely theoretical or hypothetical. It's not just a thought or threat of something that Lincoln thinks might happen. It was already happening at that time. Why do you believe that is such an important point he's making in his address, such that you made it the title of your book?
Well, because, for one thing, Lincoln, from the beginning of his career, his earliest major political address, the Springfield Lyceum Address of 1838, Lincoln, his earliest thought was that American democracy is of immeasurable value, but that it has an unfortunate capacity for suicide. So he feared from the beginning that American democracy could commit suicide. And he said it could never be conquered from outside. If it goes, it will be ourselves that destroy it. And so he believed, and in as early as 1838, that mob rule, people taking the law into their own hands rather than following the regular democratic processes of elections and election rules, just saying, this is what we want, we're going to take it. that was the real vulnerability in democracy, in part because mob rule is a kind of perverse cousin of majority rule. People in a mob taking law into their own hands think we know we're right, even though we're not actually going to allow anyone to vote, and we're not going to allow dissent. We know we're right. We are really the people. We don't have to wait to follow the processes. We're just going to do it. And Lincoln did fear that would escalate and threaten American democracy. He felt that again in one of the most formative events of his life was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which opened potentially all U.S. territories to slavery. And the idea behind it was that the territorial residents, before it's a state, would decide the status of slavery. But there was no process set in place for that. So without a process, that it really invited mob violence and mob rule in Kansas. So you have a kind of so you'll have, for instance, the first 100 pro-slavery people arriving in Kansas from Missouri declare themselves to be the government and threaten to hang anybody who stops them. So that was for Lincoln very alarming. And then when secession happened starting in late 1860 with South Carolina, and then through 1861, 7 slave states had seceded from the Union before Lincoln had even taken office. And I emphasize that because I think many Americans, including many who read a lot of American history, don't actually know that. Or if they know it, they don't realize the significance of it. According to American tradition, our Declaration of Independence says that you can dissolve a government if it's become abusive, if there's a long train of abuses. Lincoln could not have committed any long train of abuses. He hadn't taken office yet. So what this really was, in his view, a mob action on a large scale of a very powerful, wealthy minority, the minority of slaveholders in the South, who didn't get their way in a presidential election. But it was a fair election. They didn't claim that it was a stolen election. They admitted it was a fair election, that Lincoln was fairly elected to presidency. They simply said, we refuse to accept those rules. Even though if their candidate, John Breckinridge, had won, they would have stayed in the Union and demanded that the free states respect the election results. So I think this is to emphasize majority rule and the passage that you quoted, sovereign of a free people. To me, it's important because it gives us a different perspective on the particular way in which the American Civil War started. The American Civil War was about slavery. I want to make that point very clear. It was about slavery. That was a divisive issue, since the earliest years of the Republic. But it still made a difference. What was the particular flashpoint that set this powder keg of slavery on fire? And the particular flashpoint was a outvote of minorities' unwillingness to accept the results of an election and their willingness to resort to violence and lawlessness rather than accept results. By the democratic rules of the game, if you lose in this round, you regroup and you try to win it the next time around. And they were unwilling to do that. And so that's why for Lincoln, Lincoln's early statements about the purpose of the Civil War, the aims of the Civil War from his point of view, abolishing slavery did not become an official war aim until January 1st, 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. Lincoln did want to save the Union, but most of all, saving the Union wasn't an end in itself. It was saving the Union because he wanted to save democracy. He really believed that government of the people, by the people, for the people, potentially was self-destructing because people had decided that they no longer needed to respect the election rules. And
go ahead. I wanted to pick up on part of that point you were making about the sort of preemptive secession.
Yeah.
That's related to that. In my experience, it's a point that is, that's not a point that's raised as often, but secessionists and their defenders will claim historically, and even now retroactively claiming this, that the Union could have let them leave peacefully, that it allowed for that. But you explained that Lincoln believed separation was possible, peaceful coexistence after secession was not.
Yeah.
You make a compelling case there, but can you explain to our
Well,
audience?
let me yeah. So people will say, why not just let them go peacefully? Was this worth this this horrific war? Well, of course, if you're a descendant of a person of African descent held in slavery, you might have a different perspective on that. The fact was, however, and Lincoln made this very clear, there was no possibility of a peaceful separation. Even if the Confederacy had become a separate country, they would not have turned around and given up half of North American continent to the Union. When Lincoln was elected, he was not proposing to ban slavery in slave states themselves. That only happened during the war. What Lincoln and the Republican platform was to prevent slavery from moving to new territories, which were the seedbeds of future states. So if you look at if you can look at slide 2, let me see if I can screen share. That shows slides 2 and 3 show where the territories were. Well, this is, I'm going to screen share here.
Right.
This was territories as of, sorry, I'm not getting my screen share quite right here. I'll come back to that point. Here, yeah, there's a slide. Yes, that's what you see in this slide is the preemptive secession, the first 7 slave states to secede, the ones at the bottom from South Carolina over to Texas. What's interesting is that Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, which later joined the Confederacy, did not secede preemptively. In those states, the people of those states were not convinced that Lincoln's election by itself was sufficient justification for breaking up the Union and risking civil war. They only joined this Confederacy after their hand was forced by the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter. Look at slide number 3 for a second here. We're talking about the territories. So if you see here, this is of 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. West of the Mississippi River, you have Iowa, and in the north, you have Iowa and California, and practically everything else there is territories. All these were the seed beds of future states. I think I counted at one point, there's something like all or part of 18 states here. The Confederacy, going back to the point about why peaceful secession was unlikely, the Confederacy, having seceded from the Union, to avoid being shut out of those territories, was not going to turn around and hand them peacefully over to the Union. And in fact, as soon as secession began, they were moving west and trying to seize New Mexico territory as a new slave state. They designed, one of the reasons I asked to have Cuba put in the map. You see Cuba down there. They also wanted to expand into the Caribbean and had their eyes on annexing Cuba as a new slave state. So none of this is indication of peaceful coexistence post-secession. And the final argument that I think is almost an unanswerable argument against that kind of secession argument, if the slave states have a right to secede from the Union, didn't the enslaved persons themselves have even more of a right to secede from them? That secession was based entirely on they're assuming that they as white people had a right to consent of the governed and Black people did not. If you actually grant that the people they held in bondage had the same right of self-government that they did, then they have a right to secede, so to speak, leaving their plantations and going and joining the Union Army was really a kind of secession from the slave owners and calling in the Union Army for support.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole kind of, they obviously had a right to secede. If you add slavery into that picture, I just don't think that holds up.
Well, and as many others have, that all evidence points to Lincoln's unwavering belief that slavery was unjust. But you also argue in the book that it wasn't central to his political agenda until the Kansas-Nebraska Act. In your view, how and why did that in particular, how and why did slavery become central to his agenda at that point?
Well, so going back to, from Lincoln's earliest years, his Springfield Lyceum Address of 1838, he was always concerned about the survival, the perpetuation of this system of democracy, of popular self-government. He saw various threats to it. Interestingly enough, does not at that point identify slavery as a major threat. Although there's many elements of the address, many of the mob actions were directed against persons of color or against abolitionists. So it's clearly in the picture. But so, and I say this too, that, the abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, for instance, was already, denouncing slavery as a threat to the Republic. So, in a certain way, Lincoln comes around to a point of view for his own reasons later that the abolitionists had been advocating. For Lincoln, it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that led him to believe that what Lincoln said is that he had believed before 1854 that slavery was on its way to dying a natural death. It was going to be phased out. If you actually look at the evidence, that was not happening. He was probably engaging in wishful thinking during the early parts of his career. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a reality check that, far from being squeezed out of existence, slavery was potentially going to go nationalized everywhere, north and south, and made perpetual. If slavery is made perpetual, that means it's put on a basis beyond what can ever be democratically undone. And that actually was the aim of the people who wanted to plant slavery in Kansas. When the pro-slavery mob moved into Kansas, the first thing they did, besides threatening to kill abolitionists, was to pass a constitution, a completely unrepresentative constitution for that territory, banning slavery forever and preventing any future majority from ever undoing it. So that, in that kind of way, Lincoln saw slavery going national as threatening this popular self-government that he believed in, and threatening it not only for Black people, but also for white people. I mean, I think that Lincoln was part of a overwhelmingly white political community. That was where he grew up. He understood the injustices to Black Americans, but they weren't central to his political agenda until 1854, when he believed there was a danger that all of this could be lost for people of all races. And then with the secession, which he saw, as I mentioned, he saw as mob rule on a massive scale, that really sealed it for him. That kind of dramatic refusal anymore to play by democratic election rules because you're so committed to expanding and perpetuating slavery meant that this was a mortal threat to democracy as he understood it.
Yeah, well, and Abraham Lincoln still, even in the outset of his presidency, was advocating for peaceful, constitutional, gradual, compensated emancipation. So he still clearly held that belief that slavery could or should be abolished that way, even given the shenanigans of the Kansas-Nebraska Crittenden Compromise. And so one might ask, was that reasonable to believe that? Was it a popular belief? And I appreciated that you pointed out clearly the states that seceded thought that it was possible.
Yeah, so this is really a whole really fascinating question. Lots of controversies involved in this.
Yeah.
So Lincoln, unlike the abolitionists were very straightforward. Slavery is so evil, so unjust, it should not continue a single day, a single hour. It should be abolished everywhere, not only in the territories, it should be abolished in all the slave states. And that all these formerly enslaved persons should immediately become full citizens and voters in the United States. And no question that position had justice on its side. Mm-hmm. The problem was neither the abolitionists nor Lincoln nor anyone else had the power to bring that about. The only way that could have been brought about would be in the way that it actually was brought about, in a horrifically destructive civil war, which almost nobody wanted.
Yeah.
So for Lincoln, who did not want a war, but did not want slavery to be perpetual, he believed it was a stain on the American character. His way of trying to resolve this was to say, and this was not only him, this was also true of the Republican platform generally, that we will abolish slavery gradually. That actually is the way that slavery was abolished in the northern states after the Revolution. So slavery existed in New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. It was abolished in the wake of the Revolution, and in many cases over several decades. So there was a track record for that. So you can raise two questions. Was it possible? Was it just? Although many people today argue that it was impossible to abolish slavery peacefully, and they may be right. However, I argue in the book that Lincoln's hope that slavery could be abolished peacefully, gradually, and democratically was not unreasonable, given the evidence available to him. And also, most importantly, the secessionists themselves believed it was possible. Mm-hmm. They believed it was very possible. In fact, it was so possible that they had to act immediately to prevent him from taking the first step, because if he took the first step and the slave states accepted it and didn't immediately reject it, then this precedent would be set, the corner would be turned, and slavery would eventually be phased out over the course of several decades. It would be, and there's lots of ways in which this could be done. First of all, if you look at those territories, all the new states coming in, if slavery is kept out of those territories, are going to be free states. So the political balance would be shifting significantly against the slave states over that period. Mm. Another thing is that even though it wouldn't abolish slavery immediately in the slave states, it would immediately hit slaveholders in the pocketbook, because by far the greatest value of their investments was slave property, far more than real estate or any money in the bank. As soon as that human property can no longer be carried to that whole half of the United States, it becomes less valuable and also more dangerous, because the slaveholders always had to look over their shoulders at the danger of a slave insurrection. So, and there were various, eventually, if you have enough states, you could amend the Constitution and actually abolish slavery by constitutional amendment. That would have been many decades into the future, but the slaveholders saw that as a future possibility. Before that, you could use Congress's power over interstate commerce to restrict the interstate slave trade. So there were lots of ways in which this attacking slavery by this long, slow, democratic, but firm squeeze was not at all an unrealistic possibility. And it was certainly not an empty possibility. It had real teeth. I think the objection on the side of justice is, if you're an enslaved person, you don't want your freedom 20, 30, 40 years from now, you want it now. And I mean, I think that objection is unanswerable on its own terms. It's just that nobody had the power to bring that about except by civil war. And if a civil war had been started for the purpose of abolishing slavery, which it was not, but if it had been, I think it would have been lost by the Union. There would not have been sufficient political support in February, March of 1861 to win a war deliberately commenced to abolish slavery. I think that Lincoln was right to make the war at the beginning about defending democracy and the integrity of respecting election results. That gave him a much stronger political hand at these critical early years of the war than he would have had if he had said, well, now that I'm president, I'm just going to take the army and abolish slavery. That's not what he wanted to do, and I don't think he would have been able to do that.
Yeah. James, we have a few questions specifically about the map that have come in. So one is very, it's about what we're actually looking at. And this, this member of the audience asked, what's the significance of the dotted line on the map at 36 degrees, 30 minutes north?
Yeah. So that was, according to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and I haven't went into this, that this was the first of several sort of attempts to diffuse the slavery issue that didn't really work. But the agreement, the compromise in 1820, was that slavery would be prohibited north of that line, except for Missouri, which was all of Missouri's north of that line, and Missouri was a slave state. But except for Missouri, slavery would be banned north of that line. South of that line, slavery was permitted. So Arkansas and what then became Oklahoma. So it looks like slavery is being kept out of this large chunk of territory. That is what the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 overthrew. Because it then opened up to slavery all these, what Kansas territory, which also includes Colorado, Nebraska territory, you can see it includes a lot more than Nebraska, Minnesota territory, where I live, all of those things were potentially open to slavery. The northern advocates, so the advocates of this idea of this is Stephen Douglas's idea of letting the territorial inhabitants decide the slavery issue. Basically, to the Northerners, Douglas was saying, well, it's too cold up there for slavery. Slavery only can exist below some certain geographical line, except that, of course, Missouri and Illinois are in the same latitude, and Illinois was a free state and Missouri was a slave state. At that same time, slaveholders in South Carolina were talking about, let's bring slave labor to California. Let's bring slave labor to the mines in Kansas territory, which is now Colorado. So the idea that you're going to keep slavery out of a territory just because of how far north it is was a just bad theory from the beginning. To make it then worse, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 then in a sense blew up even this, I think, unprincipled compromise that Stephen Douglas had of letting the territorial inhabitants decide. The Dred Scott said, slavery is a property right. You're not deprived of your property right anywhere on any territory. And so as a result of the Dred Scott decision, all the way north, including Minnesota was actually a slavery was legal in Minnesota for a year before it entered the Union as a state, at which point it banned slavery. So Lincoln thought that feared that if the Supreme Court could say slavery was legal in any territory, regardless of how far north or south it is, why not in a state?
Yeah.
If you have a property right, absolute property right to bring your human property to a territory, why don't you have an absolute property right to bring your enslaved property to New York, Pennsylvania, or Massachusetts? And so the next line, and slaveholders were already doing that. They were taking their slaves through northern states and saying, I'm in transit here, you can't interfere with my right to this slave. So Lincoln, there are still people out there that say that Lincoln was just it was just paranoid, the idea that slavery was going to go national. No, it was already happening. It was already happening, and had the only way you could stop it was to begin by stopping it spreading from to the territories. And so that 3630 line, I should say too that for Lincoln, once the Missouri Compromise is blown out of the water, he wants to prevent slavery even in territories south of that line. So the New Mexico territory, Utah territory, Lincoln said we need to keep slavery out of that also.
Yeah. Michael, another one of our audience members, asked if the Confederacy ever looked to take Mexico to expand slavery. You mentioned Cuba.
They talked about it, yes, and they talked about it. I think their immediate eyes were on Cuba, which would have immediately entered the Union as the fourth or fifth largest slave state by population. Stephen Douglas of Illinois kept talking about how one of these days we're going to have to annex Mexico. And there were filibustering attempts in Nicaragua, as you probably know. Those were, pro-slavery attempts to create new slave territories and potential new slave states southward. And the slaveholders, if they'd stayed in the Union, they would have really demanded that because they by late 1858, they realized they weren't going to get Kansas. But they wanted Cuba to balance out Kansas. So the southward expansion of slavery was a real possibility. I also say they wanted half of California. And there was a pro-slavery secession movement in Southern California. And when the Confederacy sent troops west through New Mexico, their aim was California, to get half of California.
Dan Weinberg notes, Lincoln himself wrote in 1855 that, quote, "there is no peaceful extinction of slavery prospect for us," end quote. Because of this belief, Lincoln was the first president to be ready for war, Dan says. Lincoln's red line was slavery allowed into the territories, and he knew the South would or could not accept that. Do you think that Lincoln believed it could and ought to have been resolved through peaceful and democratic means? Even Lincoln, though, I guess, and the war came, and Dan's asking for comments on that.
So yes, this 1855 letter. So I will tell you that there are two lines of interpretation of this, and I have friends who also write on Lincoln that will take a different view than I do. One view is that Lincoln in 1855, when he said there's no peaceful extinction of slavery in store for us, that was his final word. He really knew this was going to come to civil war over slavery. I do not take that interpretation. By 1856, Lincoln had recovered his optimism. And certainly by 1858, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he insisted that he had no intention of supporting a war to end slavery, and that this could be done entirely by, as he put it, peaceful ballots, not bloody bullets. I argue that part of the reason why he recovered his optimism was that in 1855, when he said there was no possibility of a peaceful extinction, the Whig Party had collapsed. That's part of the letter. The Whig Party had collapsed, and the Whig Party was what Lincoln viewed as, probably too favorably, a moderate anti-slavery party. So that left nothing except the pro-slavery on one side and violent abolitionists on the other. What Lincoln found with the creation of the Republican Party was a moderate but politically strong party that would channel anti-slavery sentiment in a peaceful direction. And he, and in one of the speeches, in his Cooper Union Address of 1860, when the Southerners say you have to disband this party, get rid of this party. You're all like John Brown. And Lincoln's point was, if you disbanded the Republican Party, you would have more John Browns, not fewer.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
Lincoln saw the creation of the Republican Party as a way of peacefully channeling the conflict over slavery. Now, he may have been deluded about it. I mean, he may have been totally wrong. It may have been impossible from the beginning to believe that the slaveholders would accept even the kind of gradual phase out of slavery that Lincoln intended. I take the view that it was not as certain as that. I think Lincoln realized that there was a strong possibility of war, but I would argue that even if a violent end to slavery was more likely than a peaceful one, Lincoln felt he had a moral obligation to try the peaceful route, because the peaceful route was the one that also demonstrated the value of democracy, that democracy could handle the difficult questions. So that's I believe that Lincoln feared in 1855 that it would be a violent. He never quite lost that fear, but he recovered some optimism. In the end, he was too optimistic.
Interesting. Well, and so we have another question here it's more of a statement, actually, they note. And there is a double negative in it, and I'm not sure if that's intentional or not. So I will read it with the double negative. That might have been a no. But it relates to Stephen Douglas too. So this individual notes Lincoln's opposition to Douglas's, quote, territorial democracy, end quote, suggests that democracy as majority rule was not the highest political good. If that means not the highest political good, you actually cover this a little bit, because when there are nuances to when and how and what constitutes a majority, and if you have a small minority rush in. So can you address that statement?
So and I would just say this is chapter 4 of the book. So Stephen Douglas has the reputation among many, there are people still who admire Stephen Douglas, that he was the genuine Democrat, he was a genuine advocate of majority rule, and that Lincoln was suspicious of democracy. I argue in the book that Lincoln was actually more genuinely majoritarian than Stephen Douglas. And for a couple of reasons. Well, the first thing is, of course, that Douglas saw nothing wrong with a white majority voting to enslave a black minority. And so in any kind of democracy, if you can vote to enslave somebody, that democracy can self-destruct. So for Stephen Douglas, it really depended on on democracy only for one race. But Stephen Douglas was actually playing a sectional double game with the Kansas-Nebraska Act with respect to this. What was the status of slavery? What was the default status of slavery? So this will take some explaining that. So if you say the residents of a territory can decide the status of slavery, there's no meaningful decision that majority can make if we don't know what is the status of slavery before they've decided it. The slaveholders said slavery is going to be legal in all of these territories unless and until they form a state and enter the Union as a free state, at which point they can abolish it if they want. But it must exist because it's a property right through all those stages. The opposite view, which was what Lincoln hoped, was that slavery would be banned in those territories unless and until a territorial majority voted it in. Stephen Douglas deliberately and repeatedly refused to answer that question. That was the critical question. And not only did he refuse to answer it, he led people in the North to believe that slavery could be banned early in the process. He led Southern leaders whose support he needed to pass this bill to believe the opposite. That's why I don't see Stephen Douglas as a principled majoritarian. I see him as elevating his version of popular sovereignty on an unsustainable contradiction. At least Lincoln saw it that way, and I agree with Lincoln in that respect. The other thing is, I mentioned that Douglas never prescribed any kind of process by which the territorial people in a territory are to decide these things. In fact, he gutted the process of previous territories. Congress had a lot of administrative authority over how territories were going to do things. In the Kansas-Nebraska bill, Stephen Douglas gutted those. So he left it completely without process, which invited, as Lincoln said, at the first 100 pro-slavery people armed with Bowie knives to go in and call themselves the majority in the legislature. So that's why I don't see, I don't see Stephen Douglas as a principled advocate of majority rule. I know there are people that will disagree with me on this. I think Lincoln was actually a more principled advocate of majority rule. Lincoln did understand the majorities could act unjustly, but so could minorities.
So Peter McNamara says hi.
Okay, how are you, Peter?
And we also have two questions that are related, one from Paul and one from Deborah. So I'm going to read them both. And this is something that comes up a lot because Lincoln can appear ambivalent or appear to be changing his moral view when it might in fact be his view on what's politically practical or necessary. So Deborah notes, wasn't Lincoln initially ambivalent about enslavement? Didn't he say that if he could preserve the Union without freeing any slave, he would do that? That's that letter. A lot of times when that's quoted, they cut out the bottom part where he says, I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all people everywhere could be free. But then Paul asks, can the changes in Lincoln's position on slavery be considered a gradual shift in his morality view, or more of his practical recognition that a change in morality was necessitated by increasing urgency by the threat that the North could actually lose? In other words, was his change, as Douglas described, accelerated mostly by the war predicament?
Okay, well, so I'll try to take both of those questions. They're important questions. When Lincoln said that his goal, the 1862 letter, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. He's referring to whether ending slavery is going to be a war goal. That is separate. Lincoln still at that point hoped that slavery could be abolished democratically and gradually. And in fact, at the same time that he was writing this letter, he was trying to persuade Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware to do exactly that.
Yeah.
So to say that ending slavery was not a war aim is not the same as Lincoln being indifferent to slavery. If Lincoln didn't care, if Lincoln only cared about saving the Union, and not about slavery at all, he could have had that in the late 1850s. We could have just nationalized slavery, saved the Union, and that would have been that. He was not willing to do that. So he was not willing to perpetuate slavery, even if that meant saving the Union. So that letter, 1862 letter, he's saying it is not a goal of the war to do this. By January 1st, 1863, that had changed. And in fact, at the time that he wrote that letter, he actually decided to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, but was waiting for some good news from the battlefield in order to do it.
That's right. It was already drafted in his back pocket.
Yeah, and so I think the other question had to do with whether, for Lincoln, was abolishing slavery really for practical reasons in winning the war, and this is one of those cases where, for Lincoln, separating what is strategy, what is political strategy, and what is political morality is very, very difficult. He did say about, and in particular, that issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, and also about inviting Black soldiers into the army, which was even in many quarters even more controversial than in the North, than the controversial than the Emancipation Proclamation. Clearly he said that this is the only way to win the war, and he also clearly said it is right. And those hundreds of thousands of Black men who have served in the military have earned their freedom, and we can't take it back.
Mm-hmm.
So the promise having been made must be kept. That's a moral argument. That's not just a practical argument. I think if Lincoln did not believe that slavery was morally wrong and want to end it in some way, he might have acted differently during the war. If you look at somebody like George McClellan, who ran against him for president in 1864, McClellan wanted to save the Union, didn't care at all about slavery. I don't think McClellan would, had he won presidency, would have done any of those things. He would have reversed the Emancipation Proclamation. He would have ended the practice of arming Black soldiers and would have tried to reinstitute the Union based on slavery. So the practical imperatives of the war cut in so many different directions that I think for Lincoln, it is this fusion of moral imperatives and practical imperatives that I find so interesting about him.
Yeah, on that point of moral imperatives, in my experience working directly and indirectly with young people, one of the concepts that seem, still in that mode of idealism, maybe, one of the concepts that seems to be of particular frustration to them in understanding Lincoln's decision-making included, but also just political decision-making in general, I think, is this idea of gradualism. Because gradualism can be perceived as an unjust way to deal with injustices. And this gets to that point of morality and practicality. I'm curious how you answer that. Do you get faced with questions like that from your own students?
Well, yes. And I mean, in a certain sense, gradualism, an approach to something as awful as slavery, is unjust. I mean, the just thing is to abolish it immediately. I mean, the abolitionists on that moral point were right.
Yep.
It's just that, as I said before, they did not have the power to bring that about. And so gradualism, what Lincoln had, so the abolitionists had a clear, ringing moral voice, and that is necessary. I never say, I never set up like an opposition between Lincoln and the abolitionists. They came from different perspectives, but both of them were necessary. His gradualism allowed him to pursue a policy that was not completely just, but was more just than what the alternative would have been, which would have been the nationalization and perpetuation of slavery.
Yeah, I appreciate you making that point. We each, whether we have, different kinds of political power, the voting right, whether we're holding a office, whether we're, a majority party in power, there are different ways that we can affect change. And that's even why you have activists like Frederick Douglass,
yes,
who are able to affect incredible change during his own time. So I appreciate you making those points too, because they relate to the different roles that we each have to play in a democracy. So Peter notes that he agrees with all of your analysis of Abraham Lincoln, but it's always appeared to him that Lincoln severely misjudged the South and its will to fight. Are there any lessons there for today when it comes to thinking about how to understand political opponents?
Yeah, I mean, actually part of the tragedy of the Civil War is that both sides misjudged the other side's willingness to fight. And I guess I would say the lesson is that the risk of political violence is real, and let's not unnecessarily play with fire. And I will say the one difference between, we're deeply divided today, and we have, dramatic, violent efforts to, overthrow election results. That's what the January 6th insurrection was. But one of the things that's different is it's hard to find any objective difference of interest that's as great as slavery. I can find it, it's unjust, but I can find it more understandable why slaveholders would risk civil war rather than have to give up all of their personal wealth and completely reinvent their economy. What I find today is that you have enormous rage for reasons that are less explicable to me than what you find in 1860. And so that's part of why it troubles me sometimes when people say, well, some disagreements are just too great to settle peacefully. Well, that gives practically anyone a license to go to violence, right? Because, well, everybody thinks their issue is so important that it's one of those issues that it's too important to allow mere democratic rules to get into the way. That's what worries me today. So I guess I would say let's not underestimate on any side the possibility of political violence. What we should also not underestimate the capacity for democracy, if you trust in it, to resolve or at least contain those differences.
That's well said, and very hopeful too. You referenced it, and one of our first questions was from Melvin, who asked what Lincoln would have thought about January 6th, 2021. And I think I would, Lincoln did not stand in the way of there being a presidential election in the middle of Civil War when he thought he might lose. We know that he believed in the importance of a peaceful transfer.
Right. I mean, well, of course, I mean, the simple answer is Lincoln would have seen that as mob rule of a kind that poses a direct threat to the survival of American democracy. And it had all the characteristics of, a mob considers itself really to be the majority, but if you look at, it imagines itself to be a majority, but that's partly because anybody that disagrees with is an enemy and is going to be in danger.
Yeah.
It does not take votes. It does not listen to disagreement. But the mob that invaded the Capitol, they said the people showed up. This is our house. So it really is this kind of perversion of majority rule, where you think you're the majority so much so that you don't have to follow the rules. But yes, I mean, Lincoln believed in elections. In 1864, summer of 1864, it looked like he was going to lose re-election. And some people proposed to him that he cancel or postpone the 1864 elections. And he made very clear, we will not do that. If that were to do that, we could fairly say that we have lost and our enemies have won.
Yeah. We have a bunch of questions that have rolled in here, and we only have a couple minutes left. So I'm going to try to hit some rapid fire.
Can I also show the cover in? Can I show the painting too?
Yes.
Okay.
Please. We'll do that before we end. So Phyllis, I'll let you know that we're going to do that before we end. So Andrew asks if it's true that Texas revolted, led by slave owners, against Mexico and left because Mexico was in the process of eliminating slavery.
Yes, I mean that was not the only motive, but that was an important part of it. Yeah.
Okay. Linda asks if Buchanan could have done anything to stop or slow down secession between Lincoln's election and secession.
Well, I would say that Buchanan could have done more than he did, which was almost nothing. I don't. But see, by that point, Buchanan was a lame duck president, so I don't know that he could have done much. I will say that when the secession started, Buchanan blamed the abolitionists for it. That was, I think, both politically counterproductive and also just factually false.
Didn't he essentially support the Crittenden Compromise?
Yeah, right. Which was a last desperate attempt to restore half slave, half free, and make it permanent. I would say something else about Buchanan, that he did actually make an effort to resupply Fort Sumter.
Yes.
in January, February, South Carolina fired on those ships, did not kill anybody. So that literally the first shots of the war were fired when Buchanan was president. What Buchanan did was simply turn around and give it up.
Yeah.
So that made things worse, that the precedent that Buchanan set, in effect, saying, okay, we won't do anything about this really, outrageous act, made it all the more difficult for Lincoln when he did. I mean, what led to the Fort Sumter attack was not that Fort Sumter was assaulting the mainland. Lincoln was just trying to do the same thing that Buchanan had tried to do, which is to resupply that fort so they didn't starve to death.
Yeah. One more question from the audience, and for the remaining questions that I apologize we did not get to, Dr. Reed has offered to provide his email address contact, which we will post in the chat so that you could send questions that we didn't get to him. So Marcia would like to know if you could explain a little more about the distinction between majority rule and consensus and how that played out specifically during Lincoln's presidency.
Yes, well, so consensus is, so something like if you say anything that we do about slavery has to be agreed to by both the free states and the slave states. That is consensus. That was in effect John C. Calhoun's philosophy, who I wrote a whole book on. And there is an argument for that as a political decision principle. There are many places in the world that have longstanding conflicts that essentially fall back on that sort of, we'll just decide who the important powers here are and we'll get them into the same room and we'll force them to come to an agreement. The problem is slavery didn't work that way. I mean, any consensus that the slaveholders would have agreed to would have been permanently entrenching slavery and nationalizing it. Mm-hmm. So, and Calhoun was straightforward about that. So there was the only way that you could pursue an anti-slavery policy was by majority rule, not by consensus. And Lincoln faced that straightforwardly, hoping that it would not lead to civil war. It eventually did.
Right. So the last thing we're going to talk about before we close out for the evening is the cover of your book, which is a painting called The County Election, and it was created in 1852 by American artist George Caleb Bingham. What is this illustrating, and why did you select it for your cover?
Okay, so go back. Yeah, there it is. Okay.
Yep.
So there's lots of books on Lincoln. Most of them have an image of Lincoln on the cover. I wanted to do something different. And so what this shows is what Lincoln cared about, which was election. So you see here, Missouri was a neighboring state, so the community is similar to Illinois, where Lincoln was. It was a slave state, however. And you see the county election. At that point, you don't have secret ballots in most states. So what you see at people on the right side is going up to the county clerk and reporting their votes. You see the whole. You see it's all male here. At this point, only men could vote, and only white men could vote. You see some of them having what appear to be very well-informed discussions about issues. That's sort of on the right side of the painting. On the left side of the painting, you see people getting drunk. That also happened on election days. That was one of the ways to get voters, was, to apply them with alcohol. So, elections are not perfect, just as the communities that have them are not perfect. But Lincoln believed enough in this, imperfect practice of an imperfect community that he believed it was still better than being ruled by aristocrats or slaveholders. And so if Lincoln would have seen something like this image and said, on the whole, that's positive, that's the way things should be decided.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. This was really wonderful. For those of you who will be at the Abraham Lincoln Association's annual symposium in a couple weeks, Jim will be there talking about his book. It'll be a different discussion and lots more information. So encourage you to attend that as well. And thank you again, Jim, for joining us.
Thank you to Erin and Phyllis. This is great.
And Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Dr. Reed. This has been wonderful, and I know everyone has enjoyed the insights on your sovereign of a free people, Abraham Lincoln, majority rule, and slavery. Next up, we welcome back Dr. Jonathan White on Lincoln's birthday, Monday, February 12th at 7 p.m. Central Time, for a fun and educational conversation on the development of his first children's book, My Day with Abe Lincoln. This is set to be released February 1st. We are still working on our 2024 calendar, so please continue to follow our events page located on our website at lincolnpresidential.org for updates. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking just a quick moment to complete a survey. And as always, thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again in February. Good night.